Well, hello, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our bedtime series called Crime Me to Sleep. We have been reading While Idaho Slept, and this will be the 10th episode. So if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you can go into the playlists and start any true crime book that we've covered from the very beginning. Let's get into episode 10 of While Idaho Slept. Part 9, Chapter 44. On October 14th, 2022, 1 month before the King Road homicides, Brian Kohberger was stopped at 4:30 in the afternoon while driving his white Hyundai Elantra on the Washington State University campus. The sun was shining, and the nearby pedestrians were wearing shorts and ball caps, backpacks, and tennis shoes. Kohberger wore a business casual blue button-down shirt and was clean-shaven, with his dark hair neatly coiffed. The strobe lights of the police vehicle parked behind him flashed in his side view mirror. "I think you know why I stopped you," the female officer who had approached his vehicle driver's side window explained. "You ran the red light." "What actually happened was I was stuck in the middle of an intersection," Kohberger began, "so I was forced to make a left." "Yeah, I was behind you the whole time," the officer interjected. A student in a plaid skirt with thigh-high throwback tube socks walked by, her backpack hanging heavily. "Technically, you're not supposed to enter the intersection at all, for that reason. If the light turns red, then you're stuck in the intersection, and then you run the red light," she told him. "Do you have your license on you?" Kohberger retrieved his driver's license, handing it to her through the window. "Do you have your registration and insurance?" He dug around in his vehicle for the documents she'd requested, found them, and handed them over. The officer's body cam footage showed the documents would be expiring in November. "Would you explain that to me a little bit further?" Kohberger chanced. "In Pennsylvania, when you're stuck in the intersection, you have to make the left. So what would the appropriate thing for me to have done been? Just back up?" He used his thumb to point backward as if reversing into a lane. "Well, you're not supposed to block an intersection like that in Washington. So just by you blocking the intersection, that's technically a ticketable violation," she said. "Then you're running a red light, so it's another ticketable offense. So you're not supposed to proceed into the intersection until you can go." Kohberger nodded his head in understanding, his large eyes surveying the nearby streets, and then landing laser-focused on the officer again. "Yeah, there was a little confusion," Kohberger said, explaining that he had initially thought the oncoming traffic was slowing to let him turn. "Someone had stopped. I wasn't sure what they were doing, and then they put their light to turn. I thought maybe they were letting me go through." That was when he had pulled up into the intersection to make a left turn, but had gotten caught when the light went red on him. "Oh," the officer said. "Did you see that?" "No," she told him. "I would just advise, don't enter the intersection unless you can go, so you don't get stuck." Kohberger nodded his head cooperatively, but seemed to ignore her directive. "In that situation, the best thing to do then would be to back up?" he asked. "I don't know if there's a best thing to do in that situation, because you're either going to back up into somebody or you're going to run a red light." He nodded his head yet again. "Yet I was just slightly into the crosswalk," he told her. "Uh-huh," she said. "Where I'm from in Pennsylvania, we actually don't have, crosswalks. So even if you're kind of slightly, there's a little bit more leeway as well. There's a certain margin within that you can actually place your vehicle." "Yeah," the officer said. So I know laws vary state to state, but there's a law in Washington for blocking an intersection like that. After a moment, Koberger said, I'm just curious about the law. I don't mean to. Oh, yeah, no, I can find it for you, the officer interjected pleasantly. Koberger nodded his head again while the officer got back to inspecting his documentation. I'm just going to go check your info. I'll try to find that law for you, and I'll be right back. Thank you, he told her. The officer returned to her vehicle for approximately 3 minutes, where she first radioed in Koberger's driver's license information, emphasizing the spelling of his last name by using names for each letter. King, Ocean, Henry, Boy, Edward, Robert, G, Edward, Robert. She consulted a laminated cheat sheet of state driving law violations while waiting for his license to clear. She then exited her vehicle and approached the Elantra's driver's side window again. Okay, so I found it. So I don't know, in Pennsylvania, where you go to find laws, but in Washington, it's called the Revised Code of Washington, she told Koberger. So it's RCW 46.61.202. No driver shall enter an intersection unless there is significant space on the other side of the intersection. Koberger looked up at her with furrow in his brow. His lips were pursed, and his eyes seemed to be locked onto her. So I'm not writing a ticket or anything like that today, she told him. I understand you're from Pennsylvania, but in the future, don't proceed through the intersection. You can get stopped for that alone, unless you can clearly just clear it right away. So then basically, Koberger began, as if still confused. You're just supposed to wait behind the white line, the officer interjected. It never even occurred to me that that was actually something wrong, well, except for the fact that I was blocking the crosswalk. Yeah, she said, and states vary from law, like Pennsylvania might not even have that law, but in Washington we do. Koberger shook his head as if astonished. I'm actually just from a very rural area, he said, so we just don't have crosswalks. Got ya, she said. Yeah, I do apologize if I was asking you too many questions about the law. I wasn't trying to Not at all. I understand you're not from here, she told him. A lot of people don't know a bunch of laws. I only know it because this is what I do. He nodded his head, seemingly appreciative of her understanding. She eventually wished him a good day and then departed. Koberger never mentioned that he was not only studying criminal law, but was currently teaching it at the university he was parked in front of, or that, rural as Monroe County, Pennsylvania, where he had hailed from might be, there were crosswalks at most major intersections. Chapter 45. As a teacher, Brian Koberger's tendency was to play by the book. He was pretty strict as far as grading goes, said Hayden Stinchfield, one of the students in Koberger's criminal law course. Stinchfield had appeared on multiple networks, which had likely tracked him down via PhD student listings. In the wake of the murders, WSU eventually removed the names of Koberger's classmates from publicly available records the university had previously been lax about protecting. Koberger would stand in front of the class, but he didn't seem mentally present, Stinchfield thought. He would often look at the ground, apparently distracted, and would give boilerplate responses to many of the questions his students might ask, as if he'd come to class already knowing what he was going to say, instead of engaging in a more productive dialogue with them. And then when he would grade your papers, he would be grading you on what he ended up calling a higher standard. But what it really felt like to us is that He was grading us like he would have graded himself as a PhD student, Stenchfield said. Koberger's criminal law class was among the first college classes many of the young undergrads had taken. He had studied for years and was supposed to be guiding them, not just criticizing. We were all annoyed by him, Stenchfield said. The harsh grading and some equally harsh commentary on their work had been discussed among his peers. Beyond that, we just thought he was a little weird, Stenchfield added. One day, the course's primary professor, John Snyder, set up a debate between Koberger and his students. Our professor was big on the idea that if we are all going to be attorneys someday, then we have to know how to argue our case. And so he scheduled a day when everyone came in ready to argue to get our grades up. And he brought Brian, and he was like, "All right, go at him." Koberger stood at the front of the class, volleying with his students. It was like half of a 150-person class just asking him all these really critical questions, Stenchfield said. He tried pretty hard to defend himself. Professor Snyder had seemed to appreciate the verbal combat, which mimicked the tension sometimes found in a real courtroom. It wasn't like yelling or anything, but it was certainly conflict, Stenchfield added. Snyder was less pleased when, not too long afterward, Koberger got into a verbal altercation with him, according to records obtained from WSU. The catalyst for the argument has not been revealed, but the run-in prompted an October 2nd administrative meeting with Koberger to discuss norms of professional behavior. Koberger's negative attitude toward his female students was also reportedly becoming a deepening concern among department leadership, and he was apparently showing increasingly sexist attitudes toward his peers in the department as well. As reported by News Nation's Chris Cuomo, Koberger told female colleagues that men were going to take their jobs because women weren't as smart. Also, according to Cuomo, one of Koberger's associates at WSU thought her home was broken into in the fall of 2022. That associate allegedly spoke to Koberger about the break-in, who suggested a home security system. In retrospect, the question of whether or not Koberger committed the break-in himself lingered in the minds of law enforcement, according to News Nation. Several of Koberger's peers remembered a disturbing uptick in his animosity. He was demeaning to those who are in a marginalized community, those who were disabled, and women, a fellow PhD student told the Idaho Statesman. Yet another PhD candidate recalled that one of their colleagues had hung a Pride Ally flag on the door of their office, and Koberger became noticeably upset. Benjamin Roberts, one of only 4 other men among the PhD program's 24 students, told the Statesman that Koberger had begun the semester with a professional demeanor, but that as time went on, Roberts had been put off when Koberger began to consistently show himself to be more forceful and condescending with women during seminar discussions. Intellectual dominance, it seemed, was his goal. Koberger sat in the front of the class and loved being in the conversation du jour, but was intense about his delivery. He could be intimidating. He very much liked it when everybody in the room knew that he knew what was going on, Roberts told News Nation. But it wasn't enough that you knew he knew. He had to make absolutely sure that you understood that he was smart, that he had this intellectual capacity. Roberts also reported a conversation in which Koberger confidently explained to him that he could go down to a bar or club and pretty much have any chick I want. Ben Roberts was starting to experience some of the personality traits that had bothered Koberger's high school friends, and that would eventually turn Roberts, too, away from a deeper association with the man. Koberger's relationship with his superiors at the university wasn't going any better. Records showed that on October 21st, approximately 3 weeks after the initial altercation with Professor Snyder and the subsequently proposed improvement plan, Snyder emailed Koberger a chronicle of the ways in which he had failed to meet the department's expectations as a teaching assistant to that point in the semester. On November 2nd, 11 days before the King Road murders, Professor Snyder and Koberger's graduate director, Dale Willits, reportedly met with Koberger in person to discuss an updated improvement plan. Willits was no dummy. He had a PhD in sociology with a research emphasis on organizational structure and policing outcomes, and he taught graduate coursework in quantitative methods. Without pushing back, Koberger agreed to the improvement plan set before him. Trusting teaching assistants to instruct and grade without much oversight was standard procedure in the department. It was exceedingly rare for an instructor to be so incompatible with university standards that they were terminated outright. In fact, most PhD students with a teaching assistantship would make nearly any accommodation to keep it, since the funding for their tuition is tied to those assistantships. Without that, students with Brian Koberger's financial background usually couldn't afford to continue on their educational path without going deeply into debt. Koberger, however, was no dummy either. He would have known that the cards were stacking against him, just as they had been in social settings most of his life. Only now, he was in the social setting that would determine his career, or lack thereof. In a 10-year span, he had dropped over 100 pounds, kicked heroin, and gotten accepted into one of the leading PhD programs in the country for his field of study. He must have known it might all be slipping away. Chapter 46. It was late on the Saturday evening before the King Road murders when a hit-and-run car accident occurred in the street near an apartment complex across from Brian Koberger's unit at the Steptoe Village complex. At approximately 11:40 p.m., a 19-year-old Kappa Delta sorority member with a high blood alcohol level, with her sister and her sister's friend in her car, lost control and drove into a fire hydrant, a street light, and 2 pedestrians, both of them badly injured. The girl then drove away from the bloody scene. Tenants at the complex where the accident occurred could hear screams. The victims, reportedly students at WSU, lay scattered like broken tree limbs. It was horrifying, a 26-year-old witness told reporters. The Washington State University police arrived soon after, along with deputies from the Whitman County Sheriff's Office. The hydrant collision had caused a water line to rupture, and that had to be dealt with as well. The 2 victims were taken to Pullman Regional Hospital in serious condition. Police began an all-hands-on-deck manhunt for the driver. According to Brian Koberger's cell phone records, he was in his apartment when the crash occurred, the flashing police lights soon lassoing across the exterior walls of nearby buildings. There had been a large police presence while he was at home. The crime scene had to be managed and streets cordoned off, and several squad cars patrolled the area, looking for the perpetrator of the hit and run. Paramedics and the fire department had also arrived. The scene was active until shortly after 5:30 a.m., with evidence technicians reconstructing the crash and investigators on foot canvassing the nearby apartment units for witnesses and possibly security footage of the incident. First responders had blocked the most direct point of egress from Koberger's apartment unit. The remaining route to any main thoroughfare required 4 turns on residential streets with 4 speed bumps, as opposed to the single turn and single speed bump Koberger's route usually required. The hit and run driver was arrested at the stately Kappa Delta sorority house on College Hill in the morning. She was charged with driving under the influence, multiple felonies for vehicular assault, and multiple felonies for hit and run. Her blood alcohol level at the time of testing, long after the crash, had remained twice the legal limit. Coincidentally, 3 years earlier to the day of the hit and run, on November 12th, 2019, 15 WSU fraternity members had been charged in connection with the hazing-related death of a 19-year-old named Samuel Martinez, who died of acute alcohol intoxication. The university had multiple previous reports of a culture of Greek row hazing resulting in alcohol poisoning, injuries, assaults, and hospitalizations. Before the young woman's arrest in the early hours of November 13th, while the Pullman police were swarming the area near Koberger's apartment, the students at 1122 King Road were being murdered just 15 minutes away. When everybody was looking, but nobody in his direction, Brian Koberger had gotten into his vehicle. According to his cell phone data, it was 2:45 a.m. when he made a fateful 4 turns out of his apartment complex and into the night. At 2:47, his phone pinged a tower that showed him to be traveling through Pullman. Then, Koberger turned off his phone and the data went dark. A white Hyundai Elantra matching Koberger's continued to be tracked by security cameras throughout Pullman and across state lines into Moscow. The Elantra took what appeared to have been that well-rehearsed course, eventually steering into the King Road neighborhood that Koberger, or at least his phone, had habitually visited over the previous months, under the cover of deep night, like now. In the field below, the Moscow DUI patrol was questioning the small group of drunken students who'd been taking a shortcut across the grass, going home to their fraternity. In the body cam footage, the young men appeared ghostly at times, a combination of the utter darkness of Band Field, the police flashlights briefly swatting their faces, and the grainy, stuttering footage. Just up the hill behind them, the Hyundai crept back and forth. An hour later, Kayla Gonzalez, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were viciously murdered, and the Hyundai turned away from the scene, speeding toward an exit. By 5:30 a.m., Koberger's phone showed that he had returned to his Steptoe Village apartment. The hit-and-run scene was still being cleaned up. The police were there the whole time, said Jose Mercado, a student who could see both Koberger's building and the accident scene from his apartment. Whatever Koberger had done, he had left and returned within eyeshot of law enforcement. Chapter 47. Brian Koberger's undergraduate degree in psychology had been supplemented by study in cloud-based forensics, something he was proud to include on his April 2022 application for a fall research assistantship with the Pullman Police Department. He had not yet left home for the cross-country drive to his new home in Washington State. It was rainy in the Poconos, and that same month he had begun to wrap up his graduate studies at DeSales University. He had also, according to a Dateline report, citing a close source in the investigation, purchased a Marine issue K-bar knife, the most popular version, which had a centered 1095 carbon steel guard and pommel, and an anti-slippage stacked leather grip. In his application essay to the Pullman PD, Kohberger wrote with apparent passion of his interest in assisting and instructing rural law enforcement agencies on the collection and analysis of technological data in their policing practices and operations. His application had advanced through human resources, and Kohberger had interviewed online for the job. He was one of 4 applicants, and the police department's response to him would indicate that the interview had gone well. Kohberger had sent a follow-up email to Pullman's then chief of police, Gary Jenkins, stating the pleasure he had taken from their meeting and further expressing his excitement about the possibility of working with the Pullman Police Department. The chief had responded, "Great to meet and talk with you as well." The position did not go to Kohberger. Chief Jenkins had left the Pullman PD soon after to become police chief at Washington State University. By then, Kohberger had packed his white Hyundai Elantra with his belongings and had made the approximately 2,500-mile trek to the Pacific Northwest. He had been eagerly anticipating the start of his PhD program, regardless of his inability to land a spot with the local police force. But if he had wanted a career enforcing the law, it was important to stay on the right side of it. He had been pulled over twice with Pennsylvania plates, so he would have known that his vehicle would continue to be more noticeable until his Hyundai was properly registered in Washington. After visiting the crime scene at around 9 a.m. on the morning after the murders, based on those cell phone records and video footage, Kohberger had eventually returned home for several hours. Just before noon, however, his Hyundai again left Pullman and traveled south down US 195, retracing some of his pre-dawn route through farmland, now visibly yellowed by frostbite. At 12:36 p.m., his phone utilized cell resources that would provide coverage to Kate's Cup of Joe coffee stand in Clarkston, Washington, 45 minutes from Pullman and just across the winding deep Snake River that crossed state lines. In years past, badly decomposed bodies had been pulled from the waters of the Snake. Beyond the town of Clarkson, it joined the Clearwater River, where massive Swallow Rock stood out against the sky, its broad face imposing in sunlight or shade. In those frigid waters, just about anything a person wanted to hide could be successfully submerged. In Clarkston, Kohberger's Hyundai idled through in the drive-through lane of Kate's Cup of Joe, but Kohberger didn't order anything. In Moscow, police had recently arrived at the King Road crime scene, discovering the bodies. Kohberger drove on until he arrived at an Albertsons grocery store, parked, and then spent approximately 15 minutes inside. Security footage showed him walking through the store and going through checkout, but the items he purchased were obscured in the video. He departed the Albertsons parking lot shortly after 1 p.m. He then either turned off his phone or put it in airplane mode, and it was not until more than 4.5 hours later, at 5:32 p.m., that his cell phone next pinged in the farm community of Johnson, on the road back to his apartment in Pullman, following the same route his vehicle had traveled after the murders. Those 4.5 hours were unaccounted for by either cell data or video footage. During the 4 minutes between 5:32 and 5:36, Koberger's phone continued to ping on the same towers in Johnson, which may have meant that his vehicle had stopped along the desolate road, only this time in daylight. After Johnson, Koberger's phone stopped pinging towers for 3 more hours, meaning he'd put his phone in airplane mode or turned it off once more, until again connecting in Pullman. Another window of time had been created. The total of unaccounted for time on this day was now over 7 hours. There were no nearby places without coverage, so the lack of pings could only have been from deliberately disabling his cell, just like before the murders. East Coast newscasters would soon dissect Koberger's route, calling the roads and towns he had traveled through the middle of nowhere. Although to the residents of Blaine, Clarkston, Johnson, and other towns, it was certainly somewhere, their home, which would soon enough suffer from the publicity that brought true crime tourists rummaging through their fields and irrigation ditches. Understandably, public curiosity was stoked by lingering questions about exactly what Koberger had been doing along this route. First, in the 67 minutes immediately after the murders, when he drove south from Moscow and then circled back up into Pullman, then again in the daylight, traveling backward from Pullman past the Snake River and eventually circling home. So many hours unspoken for by electronic data was an unusual circumstance. If Koberger had been getting rid of evidence while driving his first loop through the darkness, then his return in daylight might indicate he was making sure he'd done it right, or perhaps he had more to get rid of. There was also another possibility, that the second time through, with his cell phone turned off for most of the afternoon, he was looking for something he'd lost. By the time he returned to his Steptoe Village apartment that night, news of the murders was everywhere, and not just locally. It was spreading around the world. On Friday, November 18th, Brian Koberger registered his Hyundai Elantra with the state of Washington. His vehicle was now going to fit in, but that wouldn't help him. By December, his new plates would ping on traffic cameras across the country. Brian Koberger didn't yet know it as he returned home to Pennsylvania for Christmas break, but there would be no more unaccounted for windows of time in his near future, if ever. Chapter 48. The King Road homicides were dominating the news cycle, and their horrific details were the stuff of nightmares. In the face of such evil, everyday citizens found themselves with broken hearts and interrupted sleep. Koberger, in contrast, seemed to have found a newfound pep in his step. 4 days after the homicides, when most students around Pullman and Moscow were fearing a killer on the loose, many packing up and leaving campus early for Thanksgiving break, Brian Koberger reportedly attended a routine medical appointment close to the Steptoe Village apartments and was oddly upbeat and personable. A receptionist in the medical office where Koberger had arrived for a previously scheduled checkup told the online news source Insider that she found him exceptionally friendly during his appointment, and the rest of the staff had also been favorably impressed. "He's so nice and charming," the receptionist's boss had remarked, and the boss didn't often speak warmly of their patients. Koberger seemed to have relaxed. His grading policies certainly had. Definitely around then, he started grading everybody just 100s, said Hayden Stenchfield, who had previously found him to be harsh. Pretty much if you turned something in, you were getting high marks, and he stopped leaving notes. He seemed preoccupied. Stinchfield wasn't complaining. It was much easier. You turned in whatever you wanted, pretty much, and he was just grading them up and sending them back. There were other contradictory signs that something had changed. Koberger started coming to class with a more disheveled appearance, Stinchfield said, with a few days' stubble on his face, which was very unusual for him. Other students noticed he seemed to be running late to class on more occasions than not. The previous mental preoccupation that we had been noticing, where it was like he didn't really want to be there, that was at an all-time high, Stinchfield said. He didn't look like he was doing great. Another student, Emily, agreed with Stinchfield. Koberger, Emily told Insider, had been abrasive toward her and difficult to work with earlier in the semester. But after the King Road homicides, he didn't seem to care about his job. He would half-heartedly assign essays and then hand back high grades that didn't seem thought out. Afterward, he didn't grade at all, Emily said. He was not a great TA. And Ben Roberts, his PhD peer, said on News Nation that Brian seemed like he was on the knife's edge between exhaustion and just giving up on teaching altogether. Another oddity, the man who loved nothing more than talking people's ears off about criminal law and cases, always showing off his intelligence, said nothing to his fellow PhD students about the King Road homicides, which had occurred in his own backyard. When discussed in class, Brian did not mention or contribute to the conversation of the murders, B.K. Norton told NBC, even though the grisly topic was so front of mind that classes Norton and Koberger shared were now being released early so students could get home while it was still light out, since there was a killer on the loose. At his apartment complex, however, Koberger was excited to talk about the murders to his neighbor, Christian Martinez. Literally, like days after these murders happened, he brought it up when I saw him in the hallway, Martinez told a reporter, adding that Koberger had informed him that the police, quote, have no leads and they think it was a crime of passion, unquote. Another thing that stuck out to Martinez was that Koberger was newly interested in discussing DNA evidence. He was talking about genealogy because I was talking about 23andMe because my sister and I had just did all that, Martinez said, referring to the commercial DNA testing company. And then he brought up something similar in his studies that had to do with being able to catch criminals because of their relatives' DNA. Almost as if he knew himself would soon be a case in point. With Thanksgiving coming less than 2 weeks after the murders, the Moscow Police Department announced that their investigation would continue through the holiday. They were working overtime. On Thanksgiving Day, Koberger texted his neighbor, Martinez, "Happy Thanksgiving to you and your family." Many students who had gone home would not return. They celebrated Thanksgiving with their families and stayed there. Within days of the holiday, snow began to fall, and it would keep doing so throughout the month of December. Koberger, according to that leaked personnel file, met with Professor Snyder and Graduate Director Willits on December 7th to talk about how his improvement plan was going. His superiors agreed that there had been progress, although the nature of that progress is unclear. Just days later, however, Koberger and Snyder had another verbal altercation. After that, Koberger's superiors began planning the termination of his teaching assistantship. They wrote to him on December 11th, requesting another meeting. Koberger's father was in town at the time, so it's unknown whether Koberger saw the email. The two were already preparing for their drive east for Christmas break. A few days after Koberger reached Pennsylvania, his teaching assistantship was terminated. In a practical sense, so might his PhD studies have been, since he would not have had the funds to pay for it outright. Had he known this before the trip, he might have packed up the contents of his apartment, including the computer tower he left behind. Chapter 49. Upon his December 30th arrest in Monroe County, Koberger was Velcro wrapped into a forest green, full-length suicide smock. The smock, or turtle suit as they were sometimes called by inmates, was essentially a hospital gown, beneath which Koberger wore nothing. The fabric was heavily quilted nylon, 10 times stronger than denim. It was fireproof and could not be stabbed through with much less than a bayonet, nor could it be torn or tied by a detainee hoping to hang themselves with it. At 6:50 on that same morning back in Washington State, a small contingent of Pullman police officers waited for their colleagues in the Moscow PD to arrive at Koberger's apartment building. The sky was dark still, and many residents of the Steptoe Village complex were still asleep, their vehicles not yet idling for the morning drive. At approximately 7:15, multiple officers representing both departments donned protective booties and gloves, turned their body cameras on, and proceeded to the landing outside Koberger's apartment. Idaho officers would lead the search, with Pullman officer Don Daniels overseeing from the landing between the Koberger and Martinez units. One of the male officers knocked loudly on Koberger's door with a tightly closed hammer fist. The sound was like a machine piston banging in the dark. "Police department, search warrant, come to the door." They did not suspect that anyone would be inside, but the announcement of their presence was protocol, and more importantly, a precautionary safety measure. It was repeated 3 times. Then the male officer used a key to open the door. "Police department." He leaned slightly across the threshold with his service weapon extended forward from his torso. He kept the bulk of his weight on his back foot in case of an unexpected hostile circumstance. There were no lights in the apartment. "Show yourself, we have a search warrant for the building." When nobody answered, he reached for his flashlight and guardedly stepped inside. Several officers in bulletproof vests with a yellow police patch, velcroed across the back, were right behind him. The Moscow officers initially found one of the 2 bedroom doors locked. Pullman officer Daniels knew from experience that the Steptoe Village management often secured any bedroom not being leased in an apartment unit, as the leasing prices were per person, and management strictly controlled residency numbers. She provided the searching officers with a key, and when the 2nd bedroom was opened, they found it was completely empty. The room had been vacuumed and cleaned and did not appear to have been occupied by Koberger at any time. Idaho crime scene technicians began to process the apartment. They immediately noticed that Koberger's unit was sparsely furnished. There were very few belongings, and the trash cans were empty. There was no shower curtain in the bathroom. This was noteworthy. A killer who had showered after his crimes would want to dispose of the curtain to banish any trace evidence, such as blood or skin cells, from the victims that might have splattered on it. That's what officers were looking for: residue of blood or other bodily fluid or human tissue or cells, but also any knives or knife sheaths or dark-colored clothing or shoes with a diamond-patterned sole or human or animal hair fragments that would match one of the victims or Kayla Gonzalez's dog, Murphy. According to search warrant documents, they also hoped to find any of the following additional evidence, even if circumstantial, of Kohberger's involvement in the King Road homicides. 1. Any digital or printed images of the victims. 2. Data compilations showing an interest in or planning of murder, violent assault, stabbing, and or cutting of people. 3. Data compilations showing details of the King Road residence. 4. Data compilations showing the location of Kohberger or his cell phone on the night of the murders, including Wi-Fi logs or metadata from photos, social media posts, cell phone apps, or computer towers, laptops, or tablets. 5. Electronic devices and accessories which might show evidence of their use to review other murders or violent assaults, or to review how to avoid detection after the commission of such crimes. Sometimes the data found on a perpetrator's computer was all a prosecution needed to tip the scales for a judge and a jury. From Kohberger's apartment, officers seized the computer tower he had left in his bedroom, along with an Amazon Fire TV stick, which would have collected personal data associated with Kohberger's viewing history. In the entryway closet, officers found a round padlock of the type often used to secure storage lockers. A key for the lock was on a TV stand in the living room, under what appeared to be Kohberger's office keys. Wondering if the apartment complex had such storage lockers for its residents, they contacted the apartment coordinator, who told them G210 had an assigned storage closet in nearby building F. Officer Daniels contacted a judge to amend their search warrant to include Kohberger's storage locker. The amendment was done over the phone, and Officer Daniel recorded the call with her body camera and would later download the video into digital evidence in lieu of getting a signature from the judge in person. Officers searched for Kohberger's storage closet in Building F. They found the door to the closet had been left open, and there was nothing inside. Cobwebs actually clung to the interior of the closet, as if it hadn't been used in months. In total that day, Idaho crime scene technicians had spent approximately 12 hours gathering evidence from Kohberger's apartment. They compiled their crime scene logs and videotaped and photographed everything inside. At 7:30 that evening, they exited and secured the apartment door. After a short break, they proceeded to Kohberger's office on the basement floor of Wilson Short Hall. This time, Officer Daniels knocked and announced several times, pounding on the hardwood door labeled 12. She then keyed into the room and cleared it, which wasn't hard to do in that minimal one-room space that Kohberger had shared with two office mates. His desk was empty, and nothing was seized from the room. Daniels locked it back up and departed into the night. Kohberger's workspace held nothing of use to her. On the other hand, there was hope in what they had retrieved from Kohberger's apartment. That wraps up episode 10 of While Idaho Slept. If you're enjoying this series, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Also, if there is a true crime book that you are interested in hearing be read, let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for being here. I truly appreciate your support in this series. Until next time, good night.